So if I were to ask you today, what is your favorite meal? I would imagine that I would get a lot of answers and a lot of responses. And I could go around the room and there'd be various different things that you might share. And so thinking of it in this way and in this posture, if I was gonna have my last meal, what would it be? Now, I'm not suggesting that anybody's on death row or anything like that, so don't go there. But if I was gonna have my last meal, here's what it would be, ready? It would be a double-double. Actually, no, it wouldn't. If it's my last meal, I'm going big. It's a 4x4, fries, large fries, and an extra large chocolate shake. Now, if you know, you know, right? If you know what I'm talking about, you know. If you don't, you're going, what are you talking about? Listen, your last meal may be totally different. Mine is gonna be from In-N-Out, and I'm gonna gorge myself, I'm gonna stuff myself. But chances are that last meal, whatever it might be, it probably has an element to it that we're gonna be looking at here today. And it's this thing called bread, right? It's a very simple food. It's got very simple ingredients. As a matter of fact, the ingredients are as follows: water, flour, salt, yeast, seasonings of some kind if you choose, but at the end of the day, it's not a whole lot to this other than that. But yet this is one of a staple that is a part of many people's meals, and it goes back for thousands of years. This is one of the oldest food products that is known to man. And so what we're gonna look at today is very interesting. It's gonna be a very simple meal that Jesus uses to perform a supernatural miracle. Now, before we get into our time today, verse 1, chapter 6, it says this: after these things. Well, before we move on, because we're students of the word, it's important that we understand, what does that mean? What is the after these things? Well, a couple things we need to know that we might not know if we were just reading John chapter 4, John chapter 5, John chapter 6. Church, listen, 6 months have passed between John chapter 5 and John chapter 6. Now again, if we didn't study God's word, we wouldn't know that. We would just think, okay, what we read last week was yesterday or a few days ago or maybe even the same day. But the reality is we've had 6 months pass. Well, what has happened in the course of that 6 months? Quite honestly, some very significant things. For example, Jesus has healed the man's withered hand in the temple on the Sabbath. Jesus chose the 12 apostles. That's found in both Mark and Luke. Jesus raised a dead man, no, not Lazarus, that's found in Luke chapter 7. Jesus taught the parables of the kingdom. Jesus chose the 12, sent them out 2 by 2 to do ministry and do work. Jesus healed the demoniac who was possessed. Jesus taught the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount. John the Baptist has also died and been beheaded in the course of this, between chapter 5 and chapter 6. Now, why do I take time to share all that? Because again, there are some significant things that have taken place over the course of the last 6 months. Also, this church, listen, there's only a year left in Jesus' ministry. We are now 2 years into the earthly ministry of Jesus. And I realize it's hard to kind of grasp that knowing we've only gone through 5 chapters of the book of John, but here we are. And there's only 1 year left. And so I believe today we're gonna start to see Jesus kind of start to prepare the disciples for some of the things that are upcoming for them. Now, I gotta point out kind of an interesting dynamic, right? So if you're not familiar or fairly new to the word, the first 3 gospels are known as the synoptic gospels. That's where we get our English word for synonym, which means they are similar, right? So if you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all of those gospels have very similar stories to them. John is what's known as a selective gospel. In other words, John looked at some different things that the other guys didn't, led by the Holy Spirit, of course, but John chose to focus on some different things. But here's something fascinating, church. Listen, this is the only miracle that Jesus performs that is in all 4 gospels. Outside of course, the death, burial, and resurrection, which is obviously something significant in and of itself. But this is the only miracle that we see that Jesus actually performed in all 4 gospels. Now, why do I take time to highlight that? Because you look at this and you go, the feeding of the 5,000, that's the one that Jesus wanted to make sure, or God wanted to make sure that was talked about? There's a lot of pretty amazing miracles that happen in the Gospels. I don't know if you know that. Next week, we're going to look at Jesus walk on water. Me personally, I would think that's probably one you want to put in all 4 Gospels. Right? The fact that Jesus actually walked on water. How about this? In a couple of weeks, we're going to look at John 11. Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. Again, I look and I go, that's pretty significant. We want to make sure that that's in all 4 Gospels. There's several other things that Jesus did where you go, man, that is powerful what he did. Yet, God makes sure that this story right here is the one that's in all 4. So thinking in that mindset, I started to kind of unpack this and go, wow, okay, if that's the case, then God must think this is a pretty important story for us to know. And it is. And so let's start to walk through it a little bit if we can. I got a few points that I'm going to share with you in just a moment. But before we get there, it says, after these things, again, staying in verse 1, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Now, before we go any further, you're going, all right, Pastor, which one is it? Is it the Sea of Galilee, the Sea of Tiberias? Yes. And you go, wait a minute, what do you mean? Let me see if I can answer it this way. How many of you guys live out west? I live out west. Anybody? I live off of Glades and 441, okay? I also live off of Glades and State Road 7. You go, wait a minute, you don't live, that must be 2 different places. No, it's not. Why? Because there's one street that has 2 different names. You go, how does that happen? Well, there is State Road 7, which in the state of Florida, that's what that street is named after. But there's also Route 441. Now, I don't know if you guys know this. Did you know that you could take Route 441 all the way to Asheville, North Carolina? Did you guys know that? It'll take you about 6 months, but you can, right? It goes all the way up into North Carolina. You see, State Road 7 is known, it's what the state of Florida named that road, but that road was named something different, 441, by different entities. So it kind of gives you an idea. Now, where did we come up with this? Well, the Jews looked at the Sea of Galilee as the Sea of Galilee. That's what they called it. Herod, because he wanted to stay in the good graces of basically his overseer, Caesar Tiberius, he named not only this, the Sea of Tiberias, he named a little town called Tiberias. So he wanted to make sure, I got to make the guy over me happy, and I'm going to honor him by doing that. I'll give you an example. I have 3 siblings. I have an older brother, 2 sisters. I will tell you that all of them have what I will call very normal names, okay? My older brother's name is Michael John. I have a sister named Linda. I have a sister named Diane. Very normal names. You would agree? My name is Gerald. At one point, I think I was in junior high, I remember I said to my dad, why? But it was interesting. He said this: I chose to name you after my best friend. That wasn't really expected, but thank you. He said, that man has meant so much to me, and I respect him so much that it was my way of letting him know that, then I'm going to name my second son after him. Now, it didn't make me feel any better. I still wish I had a different name, but nonetheless, I was like, wow, that's pretty cool. So it was Herod's way of honoring Tiberius by naming that place after him. So both of those are actually correct depending on who you ask. So they're at the Sea of Galilee, they're at the Sea of Tiberias. Verse 2, then a great multitude followed him. Why? Because they saw the signs which he performed on those who were diseased. So you have a group of people. Remember, now we're 2 years into the ministry of Jesus, the earthly ministry. He has done some incredible things. Healed people, turned water into wine, healed the nobleman's son, healed the man who was lame at the pool of Bethesda, amongst many other things. The people are starting to take notice, and they're going, hey, I have need. I know if I follow him, he's going to take care of my need, and he's going to heal me of whatever it is that's going on in my life. So this multitude starts to follow Jesus. Now, church, listen, important that we get this. This is the height of Jesus' ministry. This is the height of his popularity, I should say. That's a better way of putting it. You go, what do you mean? When we get toward the latter part of John chapter 6, in the same chapter that we're We're going to read something that is absolutely amazing to us and shocks us, and it's this. Many of his disciples followed him no more. Remember last week we were talking about being both light and heat? Remember that? Jesus is starting to turn up the heat in his ministry, church. And guess what? When you are truthful with people, sometimes they don't like it. Right? And so we're going to start to see some people start to back up a little bit and go, yeah, I don't know if I'm really into this Jesus thing. But right now they are. This is the height. He's popular. People are following him. Why? He's healing people. They want to be healed. He provides. It's amazing. Verse 3, and Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. I believe this to be a moment of respite. And you go, what do you mean? Again, Jesus has just gotten done sending out the disciples 2 by 2. They did some incredible things. They healed people. They cast out demons. They, were sharing the gospel. I mean, they were doing some incredible things. And I would just tell you this, ministry is hard. And I'm not saying that because I'm a pastor. All of you should actually acknowledge and agree with that. Why? Because you're all in ministry. I'm not the only one. You guys are all in ministry. And so there should be points in your own life where you feel like, man, I'm really pouring out and it's kind of taking a lot. Why? Because ministry it's amazing, right? When you see God do some amazing things, but it can also be challenging, it can be draining, it can be exhausting. There's an old saying within church circles, and it's this: ministry would be awesome if it wasn't for the people. Why? People are people. Like, we're messy, right? All of us, we're messy. We got stuff going on, and it can have a tendency, and maybe right now you have somebody in your own life that you're trying to minister to, and you're going, man, this is hard. It's a lot. So Jesus goes up on the mountain, he takes the disciples, and I truly believe there's kind of this moment of respite, if you will. Like, let's just get away, let's just rest a bit. But again, ministry doesn't stop. So you look at verse 4, it says this: now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. Do me a favor, we're going to take that verse right there, we're going to put it right over here for a moment, okay? We're going to come back to that. That's a very important part of our study, but for time being, we're going to put it here. Why? Because it almost seems like it's just out of left field, right? We're talking about the guys, we're talking about the disciples, they're following Jesus. John goes, by the way, it's Passover, and then he goes right back to verse 5. Notice, then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him. Stop right there. Ministry never stops. I don't care who you are. I don't care what you're doing. There is always going to be an opportunity to share the gospel with somebody. There's always going to be somebody in your life that needs to hear about Jesus. Always. And here's what's interesting. These people come. The other gospels actually say this, that when Jesus looked up, he had compassion on the multitudes. Why? They hadn't eaten for 3 days. That's a significant part of where we are. Now, I found this interesting. When I make the announcement that we're staying here at Brick, most of you, I hope, excited. Some of you may have went, we gotta keep walking from the parking lot all the way here? Like every Sunday I gotta walk? Now, over the course of the last couple of weeks, many of you have been very polite about it, and here's what you've told me. You come in and you go, Pastor, I'm getting my steps in. Right? And it's kind of your polite way of going, is there an easier way to get to this room? You gotta put a positive spin on it, church. Listen, you can tell people when you leave, I just walked down the longest hallway in the Western Hemisphere. Did you guys know that exists right over there? You take a picture of it on your way out. Longest hallway in the Western Hemisphere. Literally. You go, that's what I'm going to walk every Sunday morning when I go to church. Look on the bright side, right? Why do I say all that? Do you know how far these people have just walked? 10 to 20 miles. They've just walked to go see Jesus. I think we can walk a few feet from our air conditioning car in an air conditioning hallway to get to an air conditioning room. Some of you told me it's actually pretty cold in here. So nice, so nice. Excuse me one second. So with that in mind, with that in mind, they've just walked a long way to spend with Jesus. I love this. He looks up. He's got compassion in his heart. He sees the multitude coming. What does he do? He turns to Philip. Now, why is that significant at all? Philip, now again, you got the 12 apostles there, right? Philip is actually from Tiberias. He knows the area. And here's the example I'll use. If you came up to me and you said, Pastor, I'm going to Boston for the weekend. Do you have any restaurants that you can recommend? Here's what I would tell you. Go to McDonald's. I've never been to Boston, okay? I don't know where to tell you to go. I don't. Sorry, Chick-fil-A. They got to have a Chick-fil-A there somewhere. But if you say to me, I'm going to Southern Cal and I'm going to be there for a week, I'll give you more restaurants and places to eat than you'll be able to eat the entire time you're there. Why? I'm from there. I know the lay of the land. I'll tell you where every In-N-Out is in California, right? I'll have a different one for you to eat at every single meal. Jesus turns to Philip and he says, Philip, where shall they buy bread that these may eat? I love this. This is not random, right? Of all the guys that they could have asked, he turns to Philip and he says, Philip, where should we get enough bread for all these to eat? Notice what Philip says. Sorry, he said this, verse 6, but he said this to him to test him. Now, some of you are going, Jesus likes to test us? Circle the word for test, would you? Next to it, you can write this word. You can write perozo, which is where we get our English word for prove. So Jesus is looking to prove Philip, or other words could be examine, scrutinize, or tempt. Here's what's fascinating. This word test, it's the exact same Greek word that's used in Luke chapter 4, the temptation of Christ. Those are actually interchangeable. You go, how is that possible? Personally, here's my thought. I don't care if it's a test or a tempt. I think both of them are designed to do the exact same thing. And that is purify us and draw us closer to God. Whether it's a test from God, whether it's a temptation from the enemy, both of those the same Greek word. I believe they're designed to purify our faith. Listen to what 1 Peter chapter 4 says, verse 12. Peter speaking, listen to this. Beloved, do not think it strange concerning this fiery trial, which is to try you as though some strange thing happened to you. Peter says this, beloved. Who's beloved? It's us. It's the brother, it's the sister, it's the Christian. Beloved, he goes, why are you shocked that you're going through a fiery trial? Do you think that as Christians, we don't walk through those? Let me just tell you something real quick. If you sign up to be a follower of Christ, guess what? Your life actually may get more difficult. And I know that is not a great selling point for, hey, do you want to become a Christian? But the reality is, church, listen, God has a purpose in all of that. Earlier, Peter actually wrote this in verse 6 and 7 of chapter 1, before chapter 4. Notice what he writes. In this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while, if need be, you have been grieved by various trials, the genuineness of your faith being much more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to praise, honor, and glory at the revelation of Jesus. What is Peter saying? He goes, not only are you going to go through a fiery trial, he goes, it's going to be a process where it's going to get hot. Here's the illustration. Back in the day, silversmiths, whenever they made silver, there was a process with which they did it. They would take the chunks of silver, they would put it in a huge vat. They would turn it up to just ungodly temperatures. It would liquefy all the silver inside. They would keep it at that temperature and the impurities would rise to the top. And they would take the special device. They would take all the impurities. They would scrape it off the top. Then they would let it cool down, and then they would heat it up again. The impurities would rise up again to the top. They would scrape them off, and they would do this over and over and over again. And do you know when it was time for them to be done? When they looked inside the vat and they could see their reflection in the silver. So what's the takeaway? Guess what, Christian? God may turn the heat up in your life, and he may scrape off some impurities, And then he may do it over and over again, over and over and over again. And guess when we're done? When he looks inside and he can see his reflection in us. So, some of you are clapping because you're going, I think I have to, but I'm really not excited about that whole process. Like, I'll just do a little golf clap on that one. Listen, but it's not just, yes, he wants to see his reflection in us, church, but listen, he wants an unbelieving world who is stuck in their sins and who is stuck in darkness to see his reflection in you and I. That's the goal, and that's a hope. So you look and you go, okay, God might test me. Yeah, he did Philip. He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Jesus already had it laid out. He already knew what he was going to do to solve this issue, but he wanted to know, Philip, how are you going to respond and how are you going to react? Why? Again, we're only a year away from Jesus handing the keys to the kingdom to these guys. And he's got to get them ready. I'm only going to be here for a short time. And I got to make sure you guys are prepared and understand that you can tap into me for the answers that you need to life. He goes on to say this, verse 7. So Philip answered. He asks him the question to test him. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. My first point, if you're a note taker, write this down. Jesus doesn't need our money to make a miracle. Jesus doesn't need our money to make a miracle. You go, what do you mean? Isn't it fascinating how we as human beings react to certain circumstances? Now, what's not in John, but what is in the other Gospels, the first thing they actually say when Jesus says, what should we do? One of the guys stands up and goes, send them away. In other words, what do we do with the problems in life? Just get rid of them, right? We can't take care of all these people. Send them away, Jesus. That could be one of the reactions that we have toward whatever it is that we're going on and whatever's happening in life. Another reaction we can have is, well, how much money do you have? What's it going to cost us to make this go away? Isn't it fascinating? First thought he has. He's got the Savior of the world, the Son of God, God himself, sitting 2 feet away. And he goes, all right, fellas, let's see it. How much money you got, right? 200 denarii? It's an entire year's wage. Notice what he says. 200 denarii are not enough to solve this issue and solve this problem. So Philip's first thought is, well, we could just throw money at the problem and see if that works. That's not the solution to any problem that we face in life, especially a spiritual one. He says that everyone may have a little. We're going to come back to that little phrase in a moment because it's powerful. Verse 8, then one of the disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, there's a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, but what are they among so many? Interesting, when you look at the Gospels, you look at the life of Andrew, he shows up 3 different times in Scripture. Every single time, church, he's bringing somebody to Jesus. That was Andrew. He was an evangelist. I mean, he's like, all right, we've got an issue here. We've got a problem. Andrew's kind of starting to click a little bit. I don't know what to do, but here's what I'll do. I'll just bring it to Jesus. Notice what it says. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said, there's a lad here, a lad. If you want to circle that word, you can write this, little boy, a little laddie. Why do I distinguish that? Some scholars that I was reading through suggested that this guy was a 20-something, late teens, early 20-something year. I don't believe that. I don't. Why? Because why would they take time to point that out? Because all of those guys were roughly in that age range. But John makes it a point to point out the fact that you got this little boy. Now, what's interesting is barley, it says there were 5 barley loaves. Barley was actually the type of bread that those who were the more commoners would eat, those that just were they didn't have a whole lot in life. Believe it or not, wheat bread, if you had wheat bread, you were it. Barley is not all that. That kind of gives us an indication of the group that is following Jesus. Now, we don't know if this kid's mom is nearby, if the dad is nearby, or if the kid said to mom in the morning, hey, the Jesus tour's coming to town and I'm going to go check him out. And okay, little Johnny, here's a packed lunch, go make sure you eat and have a great day, and we don't know that. But here's what we know. Andrew comes over and he goes, I got this kid. Now, we don't know if the kid came up and said, listen, clearly you guys have a need, and I don't know what the answer is, but all I got is this. Got a couple of loaves of bread. I got a couple of fish. Or if Andrew looked at him and saw the bag and he goes, hey, homeboy, what's in the lunchbox? Like, what do you got there? Like, cough it up. We don't know, but enough that Andrew would bring this to Jesus and present it as, and I love Andrew because he's not trying to come across as this intellectual, like, hey guys, I got this. He doesn't do that. He just comes and he goes, listen, we got this little guy. He's got 5 loaves. He's got 2 fish. He goes, but what are they amongst so many? So he's being honest enough to go, I don't know if this is going to help, but here's what we got. So Jesus responds in verse 10. He says this, make the people sit down. Now there was much grass in that place. Your attention, please. The other accounts, the other gospels actually point out the fact that Jesus said to them, make them sit down in groups of 50 and 100. Okay? Something else that is interesting and fascinating, there are many more people here than we first realized, and I'll get to that in a moment. But you have this large gathering that is gathered, and Jesus does this in a very orderly manner, and I love this. Have them sit down, groups of 50, groups of 100, and we're going to start to take care of them. But notice what it says, make them sit down. Now, I was thinking about this because it almost comes across as a little harsh, as if Jesus is kind of getting fed up or overwhelmed, like just make them sit down. That's not the heart at all. And this could be misunderstood. And I'll explain how words can be misunderstood in this regard. So yesterday morning, I am driving in downtown Fort Lauderdale. I'm helping move furniture, okay? I come to a stoplight and I look to my left and there is a hair cutting place. It wasn't really a salon. It wasn't really a barbershop. It was for kids. I don't know if that's a special name. But it was a kid's barbershop, right? We'll go with that for the sake of our story. And I look, and I'm sitting there at the light, and I look, and the name on the building is Sit Still Kids Barbershop. Now, as I was sitting there at the light, I had a moment, and I thought to myself, like, that's interesting. Why? Because when I was a kid, and I heard that, it was never in just sit still. Right? It was more like, sit still. So I'm thinking like, I don't know that that's the best name for a barbershop, right? Like, I don't know that I would take my kids in there like, it's called Sit Still. Are they going to be screaming at my kids? If you own that place, my apologies. But I say that because I'm looking at this, and again, if we didn't know any better, we could assume that Jesus is maybe upset, like make the people sit down. It's not. That's not the heart. Why? Because notice what it says, that there was much grass there. I couldn't help but go back to Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. I think Jesus is starting to introduce them to this concept, guys, I am the good shepherd, right? And they knew Psalm 23. They knew David. They knew what he wrote. They knew who he was. And Jesus says to them, listen, make them sit down, and there was much grass there, so the men sat down in the number of about 5,000. Now, again, we don't have time to turn there, but the other accounts say this, that there was women and children there as well. So many theologians believe that there, listen guys, up to 10,000, maybe even all the way up to 20,000 people. This is a mass gathering. We have several hundred people in this room. Imagine the amount of pasture that would be needed for 15,000, we'll call it that because it's somewhere in between, 15,000 people to sit. Jesus goes, make them all sit down. They sit down in this green pasture, verse 11, and Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them, to the disciples. My second point, write this down, please. Jesus doesn't need to include us, but he wants to include us. Jesus doesn't need to include you and I in anything he does. Why? He could have fed them, right? He could have fed them on his own. Fellas, make them line up. You guys step aside. I'll feed them all. I'll get through this quick, and we'll be done in no time. He didn't do that. What does he do? He blesses it. He breaks it. We're going to come back to that in a moment. He distributes it to the disciples, and he goes, you feed them. Do you know what this is right here? Every single Sunday morning, church, we gather, and I like to call this the huddle, right? We get the play, and then we go out into the world and we execute the play. What are we doing? Jesus is feeding us here, and then he's saying, now you go and distribute. So here's the question. How are we doing in that regard? Again, ministry never stops. It never ends. There are people constantly that God's going to bring across your path that desperately need to hear the gospel. We get fed every Sunday morning. Prayerfully, we are those that are then in turn going out and feeding others. Jesus doesn't need to include us, but listen, church, he wants to include us. He wants us to be a part of the work he's doing in the lives that he's touching. So he distributes to them. They distribute to the ones sitting down. And likewise, the fish, as much as they wanted, verse 12, and so they were filled. They were filled. If you're a note taker, you could circle that word for filled, and it's the word gluton. Now, some of you are going, they were gluten-free all the way back then? Like, that's so odd. I mean, this is like bread is bread. It wasn't gluten-free back then. Nope, wrong word. The word gluton is where we get our English word for glutton. So what's the picture? Again, these guys haven't eaten for 3 days. They sit down, they start to eat, and what are they doing? They are literally stuffing themselves, church. This is us on Thanksgiving morning. Thanksgiving afternoon. Like truly that's the picture. This word right here, it literally means to stuff until you can't stuff anymore. You go, oh, now I get it. Now I get the Thanksgiving analogy, right? So here's what it's like. Thanksgiving afternoon, evening, whatever it is for you, you eat half the turkey. You eat half of whatever it is, and you're laying there on the couch, and you're just watching your football game, and you're going, I can't take another bite. And then your wife goes, but I'm heating up the pumpkin pie. And you're like, all right, one more bite. I can do it. That's the picture. Now again, why do we study the scriptures? Notice what it says. They were filled. My third point, write this down. Jesus can take our little and make it a lot. Jesus can take the little that you and I have, and he can make it a lot. And he can meet needs in people's lives around you. So here they are. They eat until they're filled. Jesus responds, gather up the fragments. I'm actually going to come back to that word as well. That remain so that nothing is lost. Therefore, they gathered them up and they filled 12 baskets. Now again, here's why we study the Bible, church. Why? Those are two different words. That word filled in that verse is different from the word filled, which means gluton. Why? Because the filling of the second word is more of filling an inanimate object. So for example, if I had 10 more loaves of bread like this, I could stuff them inside this thing until I can't fit anymore, but it's not going to impact this thing whatsoever. Why? It has no feeling, it has no emotion, it has no anything. So that word filled in the second part, it literally means just to fill to the top. Just to fill to the top. Once it's full, it's full. It's not a gluttonous type like I'll just take one more bite. That's not what it is. Different perspective, different picture. Both are being filled, one different from the other. But notice also what it says, that they filled how many baskets? How many baskets? Why is that significant? There's 12 apostles, right? And listen, I know me. I'll use me as an example. I won't use you. I'll use me. I'm hungry. I've been serving. I'm ready to eat. I get handed this, and I get told, now give it away. And you're like, I know what I would do. I'm just, okay. No problem. I got no problem. Why? I'm hungry. It's human nature. That's typically how we respond. This is not only churches, Philip being tested, the rest of the guys are being tested. So they go through the process. They hand out all of the bread, and notice what it says. There was 12 baskets that were left over. Now, why is that significant? Again, I believe this. Jesus testing them, he's showing them something. You be obedient to me, and I'm going to take care of you. Right? This is the biggest doggy bag they've ever had. Now, I told you we were going to go back to verse 7. Notice this. I'm going to read it again. Verse 7. Philip answered, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that everyone may have what? A little. There are actually some scholars, some commentaries, some theologians that believe that this really wasn't all that big of a deal. It really wasn't that amazing of a miracle. Why? Because everybody just took a tiny little bit, and with all of these loaves, there was enough to go around for everybody because everybody just took a tiny little bit. I am up here to tell you, church, listen, nonsense. Why? Again, human nature, if I haven't eaten for 3 days, I'm not going to just go, this is good, I'm fine. Because if I started over here in this corner, guys, guess what? You in the back, there's probably not going to be anything left for you. There's not. So Philip's mindset was, if we just gave everybody a tiny little bit, there might be enough to go around. Not only was it different than Philip's perspective, why? They were all full, filled, stuffed, but there were 12 baskets left over. What's the picture? Jesus can do above and beyond anything that we can ever ask, think, or imagine. Above and beyond. Verse 13. Sorry, I already started it. Therefore, they gathered the baskets, fragments of 5 barley loaves, which were left over by those who had eaten. Then those men, when they had seen the sign that Jesus did, said, truly, this is the prophet which has come into the world. So what's kind of our big takeaway? We start to wrap up this section, this passage of scripture, and again, just looking at it from face value, you go, okay, that's a pretty cool story, I guess. I mean, these guys came and they were starving and they were hungry, and Jesus multiplied the loaves and the fish, and he did a pretty amazing thing, and everybody got a chance to eat. Church, listen, this story is so much bigger than bread. You see, in 2 weeks, we're going to look at where Jesus begins to unpack and explain. Why? Not to get too far ahead of myself, but if you go backwards, right? The Israelites were wandering around in the desert and they were complaining. Why? They had nothing to eat. What did God do? He provided for them, right? Daily he gave them manna, bread from heaven. Every single day, enough for them for that day. They gathered for 6 days. On the 6th day, they gathered twice as much because they were to honor the Sabbath and not work on the Sabbath. But God always provided for them, and he always took care of them. So it is pointing toward something greater than this. Why? Because in 2 weeks, we're going to see where Jesus says what? I am the bread of life. It's not about bread per se. This is a great story. It's a great illustration. I'm glad we can walk through it. But church, listen, it's so much more than just some bread that is being multiplied, some bread that is being used to feed some people that are going to be hungry for a few moments and a couple hours later are going to be hungry again. Going all the way back to my first thought, why this miracle? Why not walking on water? Why not raising somebody from the dead? Why not healing a blind man? Why is this the miracle that is in all four Gospels? Because listen, church, Jesus is the bread of life. And that's the point, and that's the story that he wants to make sure that these guys understand. I am putting something in your hands, fellas, because I'm going away. And what I am giving you, you must hold on to and distribute to others that they may understand that I am the one from heaven who feeds them. Amen?